A billionaire on the brink of death. A brilliant doctor erased by scandal. When Ethan Caldwell's heart failed, no amount of fortune or fame could save him, until Lena Cho, the woman the world called a fraud, stepped out of the shadows. Together, they risked everything to expose the lies that destroyed her and reclaim the truth no empire could bury. This is a story of courage, redemption, and a love that defied every rule. Where are you watching from? Share below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful story. Ethan Caldwell had always believed he had time. Time to build empires, time to make enemies, time to outrun the quiet ticking that lived under his ribs since he was a boy. In the polished world he ruled, where a signature could alter markets and a single call could bend a senator's schedule, time seemed like a currency he could always print more of. Tonight, lying on a gurney in the private wing of Caldwell Memorial, Ethan finally realized it had never belonged to him at all. A pale glow flickered across the elevator's mirrored walls as the doors closed, sealing him inside with the echo of his own ragged breath. His chest felt like it was caving in. Each heartbeat came slower, dragging pain with it, but he refused to let the panic show. Even now, as paramedics checked vitals and whispered into radios, Ethan Caldwell would not surrender the illusion of control. The doors slid open to a corridor lined with suits and white coats. The entire executive team had been summoned at midnight, their faces drawn and colorless. At the far end of the hall, his father stood waiting. Harold Caldwell's hands were clenched behind his back, knuckles white as marble. For decades, Harold had been the immovable pillar at the center of Caldwell Holdings, a man who once negotiated the hostile acquisition of an oil conglomerate while his own mother lay dying in a hospice bed. He was a figure the press described as unyielding. But tonight, his eyes darted to the heart monitor trailing behind the gurney, and for a split second, Ethan saw something he'd never expected: fear. As the gurney wheeled past, Harold fell into step beside it. He didn't touch his son. Physical displays of affection were reserved for funerals and closed doors, but his gaze locked on Ethan's face, searching for any reassurance he could take. Ethan knew there was none. Every specialist who'd examined him in the past year had offered the same bleak forecast. His heart was disintegrating, layer by layer. The condition that had once been a manageable defect was now a time bomb they could no longer defuse. He had read every study, funded every clinical trial, bought access to proprietary protocols that cost more than most families earned in generations. Nothing had worked. They turned into the private ICU. Frosted glass panels shimmered under soft overhead lights. Two surgeons waited by the bed, each wearing expressions practiced for moments when money could not shield a family from mortality. A nurse adjusted the IV drip, her gloved hands trembling. Ethan noticed everything. The too rapid blinking of the youngest doctor. The clipboard held just below eye level so no one could see the chart. The unspoken verdict hovering in the sterile air. As the team prepared him for monitoring, Ethan stared past them, trying to hold on to a single clear thought. His mind conjured images with the desperate randomness of a dying man. The first time he stood on the trading floor at 23, making a play that tripled the company's assets overnight. The heavy silence of his mother's funeral, and how he hadn't been able to shed a tear. The curve of a woman's jaw, her face blurred by years, but tethered to something soft in his chest he hadn't named then, and had never dared to sense. A sharp sting brought him back. A nurse had inserted a line into the vein at the crook of his elbow. He looked up, and for an instant their eyes met. She looked away at once, her cheeks flushing. It was always the same, fear mixed with awe. Even here, in the last hours of his life, he was still the billionaire whose signature held up half the city's skyline. The lead surgeon cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, we've stabilized your oxygenation, but your ventricular function is continuing to decline. We've prepared an ECMO circuit." "No." Ethan's voice scraped across the silence. "You'll do the hybrid protocol we discussed last month. Dr. Carter's trial in Zurich. I authorized the equipment." The surgeon hesitated. "Mr. Caldwell, that protocol is experimental. It's been implemented in 3 cases, all of which—" "I said do it," Ethan ground out. He felt the last dregs of adrenaline running through his veins, the only thing keeping him conscious. Harold finally stepped closer, one massive hand falling on the bed rail. "Ethan, His voice was low, almost gentle. Listen to them. No. Ethan fixed his father with the same look he'd used to make boardrooms fall silent. If I'm dying tonight, I'm doing it on my own terms. The surgeon nodded grimly, gesturing to his team. Prep the circuit. The next hour blurred into a haze of antiseptic smells, muffled instructions, and the rhythmic alarms of failing machinery. He drifted in and out, sometimes aware of Harold pacing the glass corridor, sometimes sure he was alone in the universe. He felt the cool wash of disinfectant on his chest, the dull pressure as lines were threaded into his femoral artery, the suffocating certainty that this was the last gamble he'd ever take. Then, through the fog, Ethan heard something odd. The steady squeak of a mop being dragged across the far side of the glass wall. It was an absurd detail, mundane to the point of insult, and yet it anchored him. He turned his head, his vision tunneling. Beyond the glass, a young woman in gray scrubs stood with her hands wrapped around the mop handle. A disposable mask covered the lower half of her face, but her eyes were fixed on him in a way that made something inside his ribcage convulse. Recognition flared. But of what, he couldn't say. She didn't look away when she realized he'd seen her. For a long moment, they only stared at each other. Then a voice near his shoulder murmured something, and darkness pressed in from every direction. The last thing Ethan Caldwell heard was the mop squeaking across the tiles, steady and certain as a heartbeat. When he woke again, it was impossible to tell how much time had passed. A gray dawn filtered through the high windows. Machines beeped, the sounds now hollow and ominous. His chest felt like it had been hollowed out. Every breath scraped raw. A nurse hovered nearby, her face haggard. "Mr. Caldwell, can you hear me?" He managed a nod. She hesitated. "We stabilized you. But your heart is in critical failure. The ECMO is keeping you alive for now, but there's nothing more we can do." The words didn't shock him. He'd known for months this was coming. He only closed his eyes, trying to summon any feeling other than cold resignation. He must have dozed again, because when he opened his eyes next, Harold stood at the foot of the bed, speaking in a low voice to a cluster of doctors. They looked like a jury delivering a death sentence. One of them turned, stepped closer to the bed, and removed his mask. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, voice carefully devoid of pity, "I'm sorry. We've exhausted every option. Even if we airlift you overseas, there is no intervention left. I would recommend you call your—" Harold's fist hit the railing hard enough to rattle the IV stand. "No." His voice rose in a way Ethan had never heard. "You find someone else. You call every specialist, every crackpot, every witch doctor if you have to." Silence fell. The surgeons shifted uncomfortably, none daring to argue with the patriarch of Caldwell Holdings. At the edge of Ethan's consciousness, something stirred, a shape moving beyond the glass. He turned his head, heart stuttering as he saw the woman again. The cleaner. Her hand rested flat against the glass, her eyes locked on him. A guard stepped into her path, gesturing for her to leave. She didn't move. Instead, she spoke, though Ethan couldn't hear her words. The guard shook his head, clearly annoyed. Harold followed the exchange, his eyebrows drawing together. He stalked to the glass, sliding the panel open a few inches. "What are you doing here?" The woman's voice was calm but threaded with something unbreakable. "I can help him." One of the surgeons scoffed. "She's a janitor." Harold's jaw worked. "Help him how?" "Let me in," she said simply. "No cameras, no interference, just me and him." The entire hall erupted in disbelief, a cacophony of protest, but Harold turned to Ethan, his face pale as paper. "Do you want this?" Ethan's breath was failing. He could barely form words. But his eyes flicked to the cleaner's face, and he knew, in some hidden part of himself, that if he was going to die, he wanted to do it looking at her, not the ceiling. He nodded, the smallest motion. Harold closed his eyes, as if steadying himself on the edge of a precipice. Then he stepped back and gestured to the guards. "Let her in." The protest swelled again, but Harold cut them down with a single look. The glass door slid open fully. She stepped through with the same quiet, certain bearing as before. Up close, her eyes were even more startling, dark and luminous, as if they held stories no one else had been brave enough to read. She paused beside the bed, studying the array of lines and monitors, her gaze moving to the surgical port over Ethan's heart. He tried to speak, but she laid her palm over his sternum, her touch impossibly warm. "Don't," she whispered. "Save your strength." And for the first time since the machines began to fail, Ethan Caldwell felt something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. Lena Cho had learned the art of disappearing long before she ever set foot inside Caldwell Memorial. It was easier than people assumed, fading into the blind spots of a world too busy and too self-important to notice a girl with her head bowed and her hands wrapped around a mop handle. When she first applied for the night cleaning crew, she'd given a false last name, a disposable phone number, and a fabricated employment history so carefully constructed, even the hospital's background check had returned clean. But beneath the gray uniform and the drab routine, Lena carried a truth that no amount of paperwork could bury. She had once been Dr. Lena Cho, youngest cardiology fellow in the prestigious Ridgewood Institute, a researcher whose work had been called revolutionary by the same journals that later branded her a fraud. Some nights she still dreamed about the lab, its chilled air and spotless glass walls, the hush that fell when she entered to brief the senior clinicians on her latest findings. She had been 24, too earnest, too convinced that discovery alone would protect her from the appetites of the powerful. She never imagined that the corporation she had trusted with her research would forge a trail of false ledgers and then frame her to cover their theft. She never thought her mentor, Dr. Arthur Levin, who once called her the future of cardiac medicine, would let them. When the scandal broke, the media had feasted on her story like vultures. One day she was the prodigy whose theories promised to save thousands of lives. The next, she was the poster child of ambition turned criminal. It took only 6 weeks to dismantle everything she had built. Her license revoked, her grants frozen, her name scrubbed from published papers she had spent years compiling. The day she walked out of Ridgewood for the last time, she carried only 2 things: a leather pouch containing the needles her grandmother had given her when she first learned to heal, and the last letter her father had written before he died. A letter she had read so often, she knew every crease by heart. So Lena vanished. She slipped into the spaces between New York's mirrored towers, choosing the graveyard shifts no one else wanted, trading the respect of her peers for the invisibility of the janitorial staff. In the fluorescent silence of the hospital's upper floors, no one asked questions. No one cared why she lingered outside the ICU, studying the readouts through the glass. But she cared. She cared more than she wanted to admit. Especially about the man she'd watched from the hallway these past 2 years, the man who tonight was dying while an empire held its breath. Ethan Caldwell. She knew the name long before she saw his face. Everyone did. The youngest billionaire CEO in the Northeast, the prodigy whose takeover strategies were taught in MBA programs before he turned 30. But beneath the headlines, she had discovered something else. He was the only patient in the hospital whose records had been flagged in the restricted archive she was never supposed to access. He was the only patient whose scans bore the same anomalies she had once tried to treat. She never meant to linger that first night. She had finished cleaning the surgical recovery wing and paused outside the ICU, watching as a nurse adjusted the tubes feeding into Ethan's chest. In that moment, something splintered inside her. The part that had buried her calling beneath layers of shame and self-preservation. She recognized the fragile rhythm of his heart, the one she'd first seen years ago in the lab. The same silent killer she'd sworn to defeat. Each shift after, she found herself drifting back to that window, watching as he weathered procedure after procedure, as his body betrayed him in ways she knew too well. And every night she told herself it wasn't her place to care. She was nothing here. Just a ghost with a mop and a name that no longer meant anything. But ghosts remember. And ghosts see what no one else does. Tonight, as she pressed her palm against the glass and watched Ethan's eyes flutter open, she felt something electric pass between them, a recognition she couldn't explain. The guards ordered her to leave. The doctors dismissed her presence as absurd. But Lena didn't move. When Harold Caldwell demanded to know what she thought she could possibly offer, she almost laughed. Not out of arrogance, but because she knew she had been waiting for this moment since the night she watched her life collapse. "I can help him," she said simply, her voice steady. Harold's gaze was flinty, but she saw the crack there. the tiny fracture that only a father's fear could create. "You're a cleaner," one surgeon snapped. "This is not some fairy tale." Lena inclined her head as if agreeing. "No, it isn't, but your fairy tale of machines and algorithms has failed him. You've forgotten that sometimes the heart doesn't respond to circuits. Sometimes it responds to something you can't measure." Her words tasted dangerous in her mouth. She had promised herself never to step forward again. But watching Ethan's life drain away behind that glass had torn down the last barricade around her conscience. "Let me in," she said again. The uproar rose like a storm. Nurses murmured. Security reached for her arms. She felt the swell of humiliation she'd sworn she'd never invite again. But then she looked up and saw Ethan staring back. Even through the oxygen mask, his gaze was clear, an echo of the question she'd asked herself every night. If not me, then who? Harold raised his hand, and silence fell. The billionaire who had built a fortune by never gambling on faith was about to place his son's life in the hands of a stranger. "If you fail," Harold said quietly, "I will erase you. You understand?" Lena's throat tightened, but she nodded. "If I fail, you won't need to." The glass door slid open. For a heartbeat, she felt like she was stepping not into an ICU, but into the ruins of her old life. She set her shoulders anyway. Inside, the air was heavy with antiseptic and resignation. The monitors pulsed their hollow verdicts. She moved to Ethan's side and studied the surgical lines and cannulas. A faint tremor passed through his hand, and she saw that he was awake enough to understand what was happening. "You don't remember me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. His lashes fluttered, his lips parted as if to contradict her, but no sound came. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the leather pouch. Her fingers hesitated on the worn clasp. It had been 5 years since she last used these instruments on a human heart, but her hands remembered. Muscle memory transcended fear. A nurse tried to protest, but Harold's voice cut her off. No interference. Lena laid the first needle across Ethan's sternum. The surgical team watched in outraged disbelief as she pressed her palm flat to his chest. She could feel the faint, uneven beat, the same signature that had marked her research, the same anomaly no one else believed could be repatterned. Some part of her wondered if she was out of her mind. If this was the final act of a delusion she'd never escaped. But she'd seen this once, 5 years ago, in the same building, though Ethan had never known it was her guiding the hands that stabilized his failing heart. "Breathe," she murmured, feeling for the junction beneath his ribs. "Don't let go yet." Ethan's eyes opened, their dark clarity pinning her to the moment. For a fraction of a second, she wasn't the disgraced researcher or the invisible cleaner. She was just a woman who had spent her entire life believing she could save him. When she sank the first needle into the nerve cluster, the monitor wailed its protest. A surgeon shouted, but Harold raised a single hand, his face carved from stone. Ethan gasped, his body arched. Lena closed her own eyes, feeling the electrical charge pass beneath her palm. "Hold on," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or herself. Somewhere in the hall, she heard a nurse sob. A machine began its flat, unbroken alarm. But Lena did not flinch. She counted to 5, to 10, to 15. She drew the second needle and found the spot no scan could reveal, the fracture line between desperation and surrender. When she pressed it into place, Ethan's chest jerked once more. The monitor hiccuped. A strangled sound escaped his throat. Lena dared to look at his face again and saw something she had almost forgotten could exist in moments like this. Hope. A flicker as fragile as the beat she felt beneath her fingers, but real. She bowed her head over him and whispered a promise only he could hear. "You're not done yet." The second needle remained in place, balanced between Ethan's ribs like the delicate lever it was, small enough to look harmless, potent enough to force a dying heart to remember how to fight. Lena barely dared to breathe. The machine above Ethan's head sputtered out one last flatline before a single blip stuttered back into the dark. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. A glitch. A cruel trick of the brain that wanted so badly to believe she was right. But then the line climbed again. Another blip. And another. The tempo was irregular, fragile, like a child learning to walk, but it was movement. Life. A hoarse exhale caught in Ethan's throat. His lips parted. The alarms shifted their shrill song to something steadier. though nowhere near safe. Around them, the room remained frozen. Harold Caldwell's hand still clenched on the glass doorframe, the surgeons staring with expressions that blurred the line between disbelief and outrage. No one dared speak. No one moved. Lena felt the tension in her own shoulders ease just enough for her to remember the weight of her own body. Her knees trembled. She forced herself to remain upright. This was only the beginning. She reached into the pouch again, fingers brushing the third and final needle, wrapped in faded silk. Her father's hands had shown her where it belonged when she was 16, standing in a shuttered clinic on the edge of Incheon, listening to his quiet voice explain that not all medicine lived in textbooks. Not every cure waited in a lab. Some were passed down in the gaps between what could be proven and what was simply known. She had spent years in American hospitals denying that part of herself, afraid it made her look like a superstition in a white coat. But here, when the finest machines in the world had failed, she no longer cared what they thought. Ethan's eyes fluttered open again. Unfocused, pupils dilated. She held the last needle where he could see it. Her voice was low but unshaking. "This is going to hurt," she whispered. His mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen since she stepped into the room. He did not try to speak. He didn't have to. His gaze met hers and told her everything. "I trust you." Lena slid the needle between the other two, feeling the faint give of scar tissue. The tiny wound she created was nothing compared to the ones already carved across his body by years of surgeons and catheters. But this incision had one purpose only: to disrupt the feedback loop in the nervous system that told the heart it was time to stop, to shock it back into remembering the shape of survival. The moment she let go of the needle, Ethan's back arched off the bed. His breath caught. The monitor erupted in a scatter of erratic peaks. The nurses nearest the door flinched, but none moved to intervene. They were transfixed. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't deny what they were seeing. Ethan's heart did not fail. It slowed, then picked up a ragged but undeniable beat. The steady drone of the flatline gave way to the fragile rhythm of a pulse reclaiming its territory. One by one, the other alarms quieted. The oxygen saturation crawled back over the red threshold. Lena closed her eyes. She felt tears start, hot and unbidden. She didn't let them fall. When she opened her eyes again, Ethan was watching her, his lips parted, trying to form words. She leaned closer so he wouldn't have to fight for sound. "Stay with me," she murmured, brushing the sweat hair from his forehead. "You're doing fine." His voice was the barest scrape of sound, but it reached her clearly. "You know me," he rasped. She hesitated, her heart stuttering in her chest. "I do," she admitted, "but not the way you think." Somewhere behind her, Harold's voice cracked through the hush. "What did you do to him?" Lena didn't turn around. Her hand remained lightly pressed to Ethan's sternum, feeling every flutter and skip of his returning heartbeat. "I reminded his heart what it already knew," she said. A commotion stirred outside the glass as more administrators gathered. A nurse lifted a phone to call security. Lena ignored them all. She reached for the adhesive dressings, gently stabilizing the needles so no sudden movement would undo her work. Ethan's breathing grew steadier by increments. With every exhale, color crept back into his skin. He watched her hands as she worked, his gaze tracing the scars across her knuckles, pale reminders of years spent gripping scalpel handles and research vials. When she felt his eyes, she looked up, and for one suspended instant, it was just the two of them in the entire hospital. The weight of every reputation and fortune in the corridor dissolved, leaving only the fragile fact of this man still alive because she'd refused to walk away. "Who are you?" he whispered. Lena swallowed. Her answer came out softer than she intended. "No one important." He almost laughed, but the effort collapsed into a strangled cough. She eased him back, checking the lines for any signs of bleeding. "You don't get to say that," he breathed. "Rest," she said. "Talk later." "You can't leave," he said, though it was barely more than an exhalation. A pang twisted through her chest. She wished she could tell him that she never wanted to leave. That for 2 years she'd walked past this room every night, wondering what it would feel like to save him again. But she couldn't. Not here. Not with Harold Caldwell's shadow looming over the threshold. She finished securing the needles, then folded her hands on the rail of the bed. For the first time since she'd crossed into the ICU, she allowed herself to look fully at the elder Caldwell. "You asked what I did," she said evenly. "This technique was never approved by your medical boards. It was developed in Korea decades ago. I modified it. You can call it quackery if you want, but your son's heart is beating." Harold said nothing. His jaw flexed, eyes searching her face for any crack in her certainty. "If you want to call the police, I'll wait," she added quietly. No one spoke. The only sound was the cautious, irregular beep of the monitor, music she hadn't heard in so long she had almost forgotten how it felt to witness it. At last, Harold turned to the lead surgeon. "Is he stable?" The surgeon stepped closer, examining the readings. His voice was hoarse when he answered. "I don't understand it," he said. "But yes, for now." Lena didn't wait to hear more. She gathered her pouch and turned back to Ethan one last time. His eyes were open, dark, and lucid. "Don't move," she told him. "No one here understands how to replace those needles if they slip. You have to give your heart time to adapt, hours at least." He gave the smallest nod, a flicker of something that looked like gratitude chasing the pain across his face. "Your name," he whispered. "Tell me your name." She felt the question like a blade. Her heart insisted on answering, but her mind knew better. She had survived this long by staying invisible, by letting the world believe she was nobody. So she did what she had practiced 1,000 times in her dreams. She lied. "Lena," she said simply, and nothing more. Then she turned and walked out, her hand trembling as she pressed the glass door closed behind her. The corridor was no less crowded than when she entered. Harold Caldwell stepped back to allow her passage. She felt every eye follow her as she passed, some curious, some suspicious, some full of a dawning horror that they had just witnessed something no press release could spin. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. In the staff stairwell, she paused just long enough to let her body sag against the cool wall. Her breath came fast, ragged, each inhalation tasting of antiseptic and adrenaline. The truth pressed against her ribs, demanding acknowledgement. She had broken every promise she'd made to herself. She had stepped back into the light. She had intervened. But when she closed her eyes, she remembered the way Ethan looked at her in that last moment. Not like a man who saw a ghost, but like someone who had finally found something he'd been searching for all along. She pressed her palm over her own heart, feeling its unsteady rhythm, and thought, "This isn't over." Far above her, in the ICU, Ethan Caldwell's heart kept beating. Ethan lay in that bed for hours after she left, drifting in and out of a darkness that never fully claimed him. The line on the monitor never quite settled into the even rhythm his doctors would have liked. But it was a line, not a flat plane of nothingness, and every time he cracked open his eyes, it was still there, blinking stubbornly in green. He felt every beat as though his heart had been replaced by something raw and unfinished. Fragile, yes, but alive. And if he was honest, it had been a long time since he'd felt alive in any sense that mattered. The faces around him blurred in the days that followed. Surgeons hovered in white coats with clipped voices and wary glances, checking the needles, whispering that they had never seen anything like this. His father appeared and disappeared, his presence a cold weight on the air. But no matter how many times Ethan asked, no one would say her name. He stopped asking them and started demanding. On the third morning, he pulled out his oxygen cannula and croaked to the nurse who came running. "The woman who saved me. Where is she?" "She's gone," the nurse stammered, clearly uncomfortable. "Gone where?" She left before dawn the night you stabilized. We don't have any other information, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan forced himself to sit up, ignoring the way the monitors shrieked in protest. "Get me my phone." "Mr. Caldwell." Now, when he had the device in his hand, he scrolled past 100 unread messages from the board, from investors, from journalists clawing for a statement. He called Victor Haynes, his oldest friend and the only person on this planet he trusted without reservations. Victor answered on the first ring. "Jesus, Ethan, I was about to come drag you out of that bed myself. I need you to find someone." There was a pause. "Find who?" Ethan pressed the heel of his palm against his eyes. He was still so tired it felt like the marrow had been drained from his bones. "The woman who saved me. She called herself Lena. That's all I know. She's not on staff." Victor was silent long enough that Ethan almost snapped at him. At last he sighed. You're sure this isn't the drugs talking? I'm sure. All right, Victor said. Then I'll find her. Ethan ended the call before he could lose his nerve. He set the phone down and lay back, his heartbeat ticking under his ribs like a quiet dare. 2 days later, Victor came to his hospital suite. He stood at the foot of the bed, his dark hair a mess, his suit looking slept in. Ethan struggled to sit up, feeling the now familiar tug of the medical lines at his skin. What did you find? Victor ran a hand over his jaw. Not much. The hospital only employs 3 cleaning staff on the night shift. 2 are accounted for. The third, your Lena, was hired under a false surname, no social security record, no tax history. She used a prepaid phone and rented a basement studio in Brooklyn under an alias. Cash payments. No forwarding address. Ethan closed his eyes. Of course she had disappeared. She'd known exactly how to vanish. There's more, Victor said carefully. I had my team dig into older records in case she worked elsewhere before this. We found a match on her face scan buried in a Ridgewood Institute staff archive, 5 years ago. Ethan opened his eyes again, pulse spiking. Ridgewood. That's where they pioneered the cardiac nerve reprogramming trials. Yes, Victor hesitated, as if weighing the damage his next words would do. Her name wasn't Lena, it was Dr. Lena Cho. Ethan's breath caught. Victor handed him a thin folder. She was a fellow there. The research was promising, more than promising. There were rumors she was about to publish a paper that would change the field. Then the scandal hit, accusations of theft, data manipulation. It all came apart in a matter of weeks. She lost everything. Ethan flipped through the grainy photocopies. He saw a younger version of her in a white coat, standing beside an older man whose face was familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. Dr. Arthur Levin, a name every cardiologist in the hemisphere knew. She didn't steal anything, Ethan murmured. Victor tilted his head. You sound certain. She doesn't look at you the way a liar looks at you, Ethan said, and realized it was true. Even when she'd called herself no one important, her eyes had held something that no fraud could counterfeit. Victor said nothing. He didn't have to. They had both been in boardrooms long enough to recognize the invisible gravity of wealth and reputation. If a corporation decided you were expendable, you disappeared, just like she had. What now? Victor finally asked. Ethan set the folder aside. His body still felt weak, as though his spirit were being held in place by threads. But his voice had strength again. Now, he said, we find out who really stole her work. Victor studied him. Ethan, you're still recovering. You almost died. I know. And you're about to take on the same machine that tried to bury her. You understand that, right? Ethan looked past him, out the window at the glittering skyline. It was so easy to forget how brittle that beauty was. How easily it could all be reduced to ash. I'm not doing this because I owe her my life, he said finally. I'm doing it because if I don't, it means none of this. Everything we've built is worth a damn. Victor's shoulders dropped, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'll have the legal team start compiling the records. Quietly. Good, Ethan said. The days that followed were a blur of medical tests and hushed strategy sessions. Ethan signed off on a dozen company directives while hooked to an IV. He listened as Victor laid out what little they could verify. A chain of shell companies, a suspiciously well-timed media smear, a hush payment to Levin that had never made the papers. It wasn't enough to go public. Not yet. But Ethan didn't care about public yet. He cared about truth. One evening, when the sky was bruised purple and the nurses had left him alone for a precious hour, Ethan scrolled through the hospital's internal database on a tablet. He brought up every patient record that had crossed the cardiac wing in the last year, looking for patterns, any trace of the experimental techniques Lena had used. He barely noticed the ache in his chest or the way his vision swam. All that mattered was the sense that he was getting closer to the heartbeat under everything, the hidden architecture of the lie. When he finally fell asleep, it was with the tablet still balanced on his knees, and her face lingering in his mind, the way she had looked that night, with her palm on his sternum. He woke to a soft sound, someone carefully closing the door to his room. He opened his eyes and found his father standing there, his expression unreadable. You're supposed to be resting, Harold said quietly. I will, Ethan said, voice hoarse. After I finish this. You think you can resurrect her reputation? Harold asked, not unkindly. You think you can change what people remember? I think if I don't try, I'm no better than the ones who destroyed her, Ethan said. His father studied him for a long moment. Then, to Ethan's surprise, he sat in the chair by the bed. The last time Harold had done that, Ethan had been 12, feverish and half delirious. Your mother would have liked her, Harold said softly. Ethan blinked. The admission landed with more weight than any accusation could have. I think so too, he whispered. For a few minutes they sat in silence, father and son listening to the steady beeping that filled the room. It was imperfect, erratic, but it was life. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was living for something bigger than the survival of Caldwell Holdings. He was living to make sure no one ever called her a ghost again. By the time Ethan Caldwell was discharged from the hospital, the city had transformed itself twice over. The late winter storms had melted into a damp, fickle spring, the sort of weather that left Manhattan smelling of thawed concrete and cheap cologne. From the backseat of his armored car, he watched raindrops track down the tinted windows and felt a strange hush inside his own chest, as if his heart hadn't decided whether to stay or go. Victor waited for him at Caldwell Tower, standing under the portico with a folder pressed flat to his chest. He didn't say a word as Ethan stepped out into the drizzle, just studied him with the same wary respect he had worn the first time they'd closed a billion-dollar acquisition together. Maybe that was what happened when you survived something you weren't meant to. Everyone looked at you like you'd come back from a place they didn't dare imagine. In the private elevator, Ethan braced one hand on the polished steel wall. His reflection stared back at him, thinner, the angles sharper, the shadows under his eyes deeper than they'd ever been. But there was something else in his face he couldn't dismiss, determination, or maybe something closer to defiance. You shouldn't be here, Victor said finally, voice low. You're not ready. I'm as ready as I'm going to be, Ethan said. Victor exhaled. The board has been calling non-stop. The investors are in a panic. The stock took a 5% dive last week. I don't care. Victor studied him, then handed over the folder. I know you don't. That's why I kept digging. Ethan flipped it open. Inside were printouts of internal memos, a trail of signatures linking Trident Pharmaceutics to the shell companies that had absorbed Lena's research. He scanned each page carefully, his pulse steady despite the fury tightening his chest. It was all there. The payoffs to Levin, the timing of the media leaks, the patent transfers disguised as routine asset swaps. This is enough to start, Ethan said. Victor frowned. Start what exactly? Start making this right. You realize if you go public, Trident will bury you. They'll bury this company. The board will try to force you out. Ethan closed the folder and met his friend's gaze. Let them try. Victor swallowed. What about her? Ethan pressed the folder against his chest. He could still see her standing in that ICU, her hand braced on his sternum, like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. She deserves her name back, he said. That's not what I asked. Ethan hesitated, feeling the truth rise up his throat, bitter and clean. I don't know what I'm to her, he admitted, but I know what she is to me. Victor didn't press. He just nodded and turned toward the doors. That afternoon, Ethan walked into the executive boardroom for the first time since his collapse. The air smelled of fresh varnish and old fear. 12 men and women in expensive suits turned as one to look at him. He recognized the hunger in their eyes, the calculation, the unspoken question of whether he was still fit to lead. He didn't wait for them to ask. I'm aware of the speculation, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm aware of the calls for a transitional CEO. A murmur passed around the table. Ethan set the folder on the polished mahogany. I'm also aware that the company we partnered with on Project Atlas committed intellectual theft and destroyed a researcher's life to cover it up. The head of legal, a gray-haired man named Barrow, shifted uncomfortably. Ethan. I'm not finished, Ethan said quietly. The murmuring ceased. I'm prepared to terminate all pending contracts with Trident effective immediately, he continued. I'm also prepared to release this evidence to the press. Barrow looked like he might faint. Do you have any idea what you're saying? The fallout will be considerable, Ethan agreed, but so will the fallout if we're complicit in burying this. A woman at the far end of the table, Janine, head of investor relations, spoke up. This will tank the IPO. The market confidence. I don't care about market confidence, Ethan snapped. I care about the truth. No one spoke for a long moment. The rain tapped steadily against the windows behind him. Finally, Barrow exhaled. You'll need corroboration. The woman in question, this Dr. Cho, she'll have to testify. Ethan nodded once. Then I'll find her. Even if you do, Janine said carefully, there's no guarantee she'll cooperate. He thought of her voice in the dark, soft but unbreakable. You don't get to say that. She will, he said simply. He left them arguing in his wake. By the time he reached his office, he felt almost lightheaded. His heart thumped unevenly, reminding him that he wasn't invincible, but for the first time since he was a teenager, he didn't feel like a prisoner of his own life. He felt like a man with a purpose. That night, when the tower emptied out and the lights went dark one by one, Ethan remained in his chair, staring at the skyline. He thought of Lena, of the way she had looked past the suits and the machines and the reputation to see a person worth saving. He wondered if she understood how that single act had realigned every axis of his world. In the morning, Victor returned with more news. I traced a charitable fund she donated to under an alias, he said, setting another folder on the desk. They remember her volunteering at their clinic on weekends. Said she never asked for pay. She just showed up and helped. Ethan turned the folder over in his hands, as if he could glean some hidden clue from the creases in the manila. She'll be harder to find now that she knows you're looking, Victor warned. Then I'll stop looking the way they expect me to, Ethan murmured. What does that mean? It means, Ethan said, rising to his feet, that if I want to find someone who doesn't want to be found, I have to go where no one thinks to look. Victor looked exasperated. You almost died. Maybe you should let this go. Ethan met his eyes, unflinching. I'm alive because she didn't let me go. Victor had no reply for that. In the days that followed, Ethan left the tower more than he had in years. He visited the soup kitchen where Lena had once stacked crates at dawn, the clinic where she'd cleaned instruments long after everyone else left, the laundromat where she'd been seen slipping out into the rain. Each place felt like a breadcrumb in a trail only he could follow. And with every stop, he felt the myth of his own invulnerability fall away, replaced by something more honest. He was a man with a damaged heart, but he was also a man willing to be seen as human. Late one evening, he found himself sitting on a cracked bench outside a low-rise apartment building in Queens. The neon sign over the bodega next door flickered in and out, painting the wet pavement in broken light. He didn't know why he was here, only that something in his chest had pulled him to this exact spot. When the door to the building finally opened, and a woman stepped out with her hood pulled low, he knew before she looked up that it was her. His pulse gave a single defiant kick, as if to remind him it could still surprise him. Lena, he called softly. She stopped mid-step. For a second she didn't lift her head, and he wondered if she might bolt. But then she did look up, and in the uncertain glow of the streetlight, her eyes met his. You shouldn't be here, she said. I know, Ethan said. You're supposed to be dead, she murmured. He almost smiled. I'm not. Why? He took a step closer, feeling the rain start again, soft and cold on his face. Because you wouldn't let me go. She shook her head like she couldn't decide if she was angry or just tired. You don't understand what you're doing. Yes, Ethan said quietly. I do. He held her gaze, feeling something inside him settle into place. The rain pooled in the hollow of his throat, soaking his shirt, but he didn't care. All that mattered was that she was here, real and unvanished. You saved my life, he whispered. Now let me help you take yours back. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked away. When she spoke, her voice was as raw as the night air. I don't know how, she admitted. Then we'll figure it out together, he said. And for a moment, just long enough to believe in something better, neither of them moved. The courthouse steps were slick with last night's rain, and the cold March wind chased litter along the curb, tangling it around the ankles of the reporters already jostling for a better angle. Camera lenses gleamed under the overcast sky, rows of black umbrellas shifting like restless crows. Ethan felt the hush that preceded spectacle, the breathless anticipation of a story too salacious to ignore. Victor stood beside him, phone in hand, murmuring last-minute instructions to the legal team. A low murmur of worry threaded through every exchange. They all knew what was about to happen would either mark the first day of the Caldwell Empire's resurrection or the start of its unraveling. "You still have time to call this off," Victor said without looking up. "I'm not calling it off," Ethan answered. Victor sighed, pocketing the phone. "Then you'd better pray she shows up." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't have to, because when the courthouse doors swung open behind them, he already knew. He felt it in the hollow space just under his ribs, in the strange steadiness that had taken hold the moment he saw her standing under the archway inside. Her face pale, but her spine straight as a blade. Lena stepped into the gray light, and every camera on the block turned toward her like iron filings drawn to a magnet. She didn't flinch. She didn't glance at the huddle of journalists or the curious onlookers pressing against the barricades. She only looked at Ethan. For a moment, the chaos fell away, and all that remained was the quiet understanding passing between them. "We do this together." He moved to her side. She hesitated, then let him offer his arm, her gloved hand curling around the fabric of his coat as if it was the only steady thing in the world. He felt that contact in his bones. "You don't have to say anything to them," he murmured as they descended the steps. "I know," she said softly, "but I will." The journalists surged forward, questions erupting in overlapping shouts. Ethan ignored them, guiding Lena through the gauntlet of microphones and flashes. The security team flanked them, trying in vain to keep the press at bay. Someone shouted a question that made Lena stiffen. "Dr. Cho, do you still deny the allegations that you falsified your research?" She stopped walking. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought she might turn back. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the cameras head-on. "I denied them then," she said, her voice carrying clear through the wind, "and I deny them now." A fresh volley of questions erupted. Ethan placed his hand over hers where it rested on his arm, silently urging her to keep moving. Together, they passed through the glass doors into the courthouse lobby. The noise dropped away as the doors closed behind them, leaving only the hush of marble floors and the echo of their footsteps. Victor caught up, his expression taut. "The defense is going to fight this every inch," he warned. Ethan nodded. "Let them." Lena said nothing. She was staring up at the carved ceiling, her eyes distant, as if she were bracing herself to walk back into the wreckage she'd spent 5 years trying to outrun. When they entered the courtroom, the defense attorneys were already seated in a neat row of dark suits and pinched expressions. Ethan recognized 2 of them. Trident's in-house counsel and the senior partner of a firm notorious for making inconvenient stories disappear. One of the lawyers, a lean man with silver hair and an immaculate tie, rose as they approached the plaintiff's table. His gaze flicked over Lena with a practiced, dismissive disdain. "Miss Cho," he said, emphasizing the honorific, "I trust you understand that any statements you make today will be under oath." Lena met his gaze without blinking. "I understand." The bailiff called the court to order. As the judge took her seat, Ethan felt the energy in the room shift. Hundreds of eyes trained on the woman who had come back from professional death to face her accusers. For the first 2 hours, the defense tried to undermine her credibility. They recited every accusation ever leveled against her, displaying the old headlines on oversized boards: Dr. Lena Cho in scandal, whistleblower or fraud, a career in ruins. Lena didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still as they dissected her past, her hands folded on the table, her breath measured. But Ethan felt the tension humming through her, a tremor she refused to show the world. When it was finally her turn to speak, the room grew so quiet that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. Lena stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that didn't quite steady, and walked to the witness stand. She placed her palm on the Bible, swore her oath, and met the judge's gaze. "Dr. Cho," Ethan's attorney began gently, "can you tell us in your own words what happened 5 years ago?" Lena's eyes flicked to Ethan. Just once, just long enough for him to nod, and then she looked straight ahead. "I was a research fellow at Ridgewood," she began, her voice low but clear. "My focus was on bioelectrical modulation for end-stage cardiac patients. The technique was unorthodox. Some people in the field called it impossible. But it worked, at least in early trials." She paused, drawing a breath. Her gaze dropped to her hands. When Trident approached Ridgewood about acquiring our research, I raised concerns about the timing, about the gaps in their clinical data, about the money that was changing hands behind closed doors. And what happened when you raised those concerns? Lena's mouth tightened. They fabricated evidence that I'd falsified my results. My mentor, Dr. Levin, signed an affidavit confirming it. Within 2 weeks, I lost my position, my license, and my funding. Did you ever profit from your research being sold? No, she whispered. I never saw $1. Did you ever falsify data? No. Ethan's chest burned. Even knowing the truth, it still felt like witnessing a crucifixion. The defense took their turn, rising one by one to cross-examine her. They threw every accusation they could muster: self-interest, desperation, vindictiveness. They quoted old depositions, cherry-picked lines to make her look calculating. But Lena never raised her voice. She never wavered. When they asked her why she waited so long to come forward, she answered without apology. Because no one would listen. Because every time I tried to speak, you called me a liar. The lead defense attorney stepped closer, voice dripping disdain. And why should this court believe you now? Lena turned her head, and for the first time in hours, she looked straight at Ethan. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something harder. You don't have to believe me, she said evenly. But you have to believe him, because the man you see sitting there was dying, and nothing you did could save him. The technique you tried to bury in legal threats and slander brought him back. A ripple passed through the gallery. Ethan felt something shatter inside him, a weight that had been pressing against his ribs since the night she walked into his ICU. The judge called a recess. As the attorneys began gathering their papers, Ethan stood, ignoring Victor's protests, and crossed the aisle to the witness stand. Lena looked up as he approached. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two people who had been reduced to footnotes in each other's lives, and who had chosen, against every warning, to step back into the light. You didn't have to do this, he said softly. Her smile was as tired as it was fierce. Yes, she whispered, I did. They returned to the plaintiff's table side by side. The hours that followed blurred into a montage of testimony and cross-examinations, exhibits and objections. But through it all, Ethan felt an unshakable clarity that this was what survival looked like. Not just a beating heart, but a willingness to stand up and tell the truth, even when it cost everything. When court adjourned for the day, the reporters flooded the steps again. Flashes burst around them as Ethan placed a hand on Lena's back and guided her past the cameras. Do you regret it? She asked when they reached the curb, her voice low. Never, he said. She nodded, though he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The fight had only just begun, and they both knew it. But for the first time, she wasn't alone in it. Neither of them were. When the verdict finally came, the courthouse was so full that even the marble columns seemed to hold their breath. Reporters leaned over the wooden barriers, their phones raised in unison. Investors, lawyers, board members, and the curious public crowded shoulder to shoulder, everyone waiting for the final note in a story no one had seen coming. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded so tightly the bones in his knuckles ached. Beside him, Lena looked as if she had spent the night holding herself together by sheer force of will. She wore the same gray suit she had testified in, the same quiet composure, but her eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes of a woman who expected to be erased. The judge's voice was steady as she read the ruling, but Ethan felt every word like a blow and a reprieve all at once. Trident Pharmaceutics found guilty of fraud, misappropriation of intellectual property, conspiracy to defame, ordered to surrender patents and pay damages that would take years to tally. He closed his eyes as the last sentence echoed across the chamber. It wasn't everything, not all the lives that had been lost, not all the years Lena had spent in exile, but it was something. It was a place to start again. He looked at her, waiting for her to meet his gaze. When she did, the smallest of smiles touched her mouth, too fragile to last more than a heartbeat. But it was there, and it was real. Outside, the crowd had tripled. By the time they emerged into the sunlight, the cameras were a solid wall of glass and plastic. Microphones thrust forward, voices tumbled over each other, a chaotic chorus of questions. Mr. Caldwell, what will this mean for Caldwell Holdings? Dr. Cho, are you planning to sue Ridgewood? Do you have any comment for the patients who? Ethan ignored them all. He stepped in front of Lena, blocking the worst of the flashes. She didn't shrink back. She simply reached for his hand, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. For a second, the crowd seemed to blur at the edges, their clamor receding to something unimportant. Ready? He asked. Her fingers tightened on his. No, she admitted, but I'll go anyway. They descended the steps together. Behind them, Victor followed, his expression torn between relief and disbelief. Ethan paused at the bottom, turning to face the cameras one last time. I'll answer one question, he called, his voice carrying over the crowd. The noise softened. A woman from the Times raised her hand, her pen poised. Mr. Caldwell, why risk your company, your reputation for this? He didn't hesitate. Because some debts can't be paid with money, he said, and some people deserve the chance to tell the truth. No one spoke after that. The reporters stood frozen, their microphones lowered. In the hush, Ethan felt something like peace begin to bloom in his chest. They slipped into the waiting car. The driver pulled away from the curb with the precision of someone used to navigating mobs. The courthouse receded in the side mirror. Lena sat beside him, her shoulders pressed back into the leather seat. She looked so tired that he wanted to reach over and pull her against his side, to shield her from the world for just a minute. Instead, he folded her hand in both of his and let the silence stretch between them. You were incredible, he said at last. I was terrified, she whispered. But you still did it. Her eyes lifted to his. So did you. The car eased onto the bridge. Midtown stretched in all directions, the skyline jagged and bright in the cold spring light. For the first time in years, Ethan felt unbound from the weight of what people expected of him. He was just a man who had almost died, and the woman who had saved him, both of them scarred in ways no newspaper would ever fully understand. When they reached the tower, the lobby was deserted, the security staff keeping the press corralled on the sidewalk. He led her through the private elevator, up to the top floor where the glass walls overlooked the city. Inside his office, he set her bag on the long conference table. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the scale of it all, the skyline, the polished floor, the sprawling conference chairs where entire fortunes had been wagered and won. You hate this place, she said quietly, not a question. He exhaled. I hate what it turned me into. Her gaze softened. And what is that? A man who forgot that people are more important than power. She didn't contradict him. She simply walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. He watched her reflection, the way the city lights outlined her profile. I don't know what happens now, she murmured. Neither do I. She turned. Her eyes searched his face as if she were trying to measure how much of what he'd promised was real. You still have a company to run, a life to repair. I'm not interested in repairing it the old way, he said, and whatever comes next, I don't want to do it alone. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then she surprised them both by closing the distance between them, her hand rising to touch the faint scar at the base of his throat. I don't know if I can stay, she whispered. I don't know if I can be that brave again. He covered her hand with his own. Then we'll be afraid together. She let out a shaky laugh, her forehead pressing against his chest. He felt her breath tremble, her shoulders loosen. They stood like that for a long time. No words, no expectations, just the relief of finally being seen. Days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The press ran headlines that veered between admiration and suspicion. Investors sent cautious feelers, trying to gauge whether Ethan's gamble had been brilliance or madness. The board convened emergency sessions to strategize damage control. Through it all, Ethan and Lena kept out of sight, splitting their time between the tower and the small lab he had reopened in her name. Some nights, he found her there long after everyone else had gone home, bent over her old notes, cross-referencing decades of cardiac research. He never interrupted. He would stand in the doorway with his tie loosened and watch her work, struck every time by the simple fact that she was still here, unbroken. One evening, as she charted new protocols on the glass wall, she paused mid-sentence. Her marker hovered in the air. What is it? He asked, her mouth curved. I don't know who I am anymore, she said, almost wonderingly. I'm not the girl they ruined, but I'm not the woman they made up in their headlines either. He crossed the room and pressed a kiss to the side of her head. "You're just Lena. And is that enough?" He turned her to face him. "It's everything." For a while, it was enough to simply keep building, to trust that the rest would follow. They spent hours reviewing the destroyed studies, reassembling the data that had been scattered to the wind. Every file was another piece of her life reclaimed. Every diagram, another reason to believe that redemption was not just a fantasy. But no victory stayed untouched for long. Late one night, Victor called with a voice sharp enough to pierce the quiet. "You need to see this." Ethan sat in his office with Lena at his side as Victor set a tablet on the desk. A leaked internal memo scrolled across the screen, proof that Trident had no intention of honoring the judgment. They planned to refile under a foreign subsidiary and bury the patent ownership in appeals. Lena's face went blank. Ethan felt her hand go cold in his. "They'll never stop," she said hoarsely. "No," he agreed. "But neither will we." The fight wasn't over. He could feel it stretching in front of them. Another long road neither of them had chosen. But he no longer feared it the way he once had. Because this time, they would walk it side by side. And no matter how long it took, he was prepared to follow her into every courtroom, every laboratory, every dark corridor the world had tried to lock her in. Because some debts could not be measured in dollars. Some were written in the simple truth of a heartbeat refusing to quit. The private jet that lifted off from Teterboro under the cover of night felt nothing like the corporate aircraft Ethan had grown up boarding. There was no leather-bound bar cart stocked with whiskey and rare scotch, no carefully curated selection of cigars for clients who liked to pretend their deals were matters of life and death. This time, it was just him, Lena, and the two surgeons who had quietly agreed to risk their careers to attempt a procedure no American hospital would sanction. Lena sat by the window with her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since they'd boarded. Moonlight spilled over her hair, silvering the curve of her cheek, but her eyes were fixed on some place far beyond the clouds. Ethan wished he knew what she was thinking. Whether she was bracing herself for the worst or trying to imagine what it might feel like to finally win. The engines thrummed under his feet, steady and implacable. He took a moment to appreciate that he could feel it at all. Months ago, he would have assumed there would always be more time, more years to postpone the reckoning he knew had been coming since the day he'd collapsed on that golf course. But tonight, with every mile that fell behind them, he understood that the only thing that had ever mattered was this choice, to fight alongside her, even if it meant neither of them would walk away unscarred. When the pilot announced they would be descending over Reykjavik in 20 minutes, Lena finally turned her head. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the hum of the cabin. "I'm sure," Ethan said. Her gaze searched his face as if she expected to find hesitation there. When she didn't, she nodded once and looked out the window again. The Icelandic clinic was an unassuming building tucked behind a weather-beaten row of pines. No sign announced its presence. No polished brass plaque listed a roster of visiting specialists. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd drive past it without a second thought. Ethan felt a peculiar sense of rightness in that. The world had tried so hard to bury the truth, to make them both invisible. It felt fitting that the place where they would finally take it back was hidden in plain sight. Inside, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and rain. Lena moved with brisk efficiency, her mind clearly already in the realm of surgical planning. He watched her consult with the team, her hands gesturing in that way he had come to recognize, precise, decisive, utterly fearless when it came to her work. Hours blurred past, preoperative scans, labs, final waivers. At some point, Ethan stopped trying to keep track of the medical details. He focused on memorizing her face instead, every angle of her expression, as she mapped out the procedure she had once only dreamed of. Just before dawn, she slipped into the small room where he was waiting, a stack of papers in her hands. She set them on the table and sank into the chair opposite him. For a long moment, she didn't speak. "I wish there was another way," she said finally. He shook his head. "There isn't. If this doesn't work, then it doesn't." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "You're too calm about this." He reached across the table and laced his fingers through hers. You taught me how to be." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I don't want to be the reason." "You're the reason I'm still here," he interrupted. "Don't ever apologize for that." A single tear slipped free, catching on the curve of her cheek. She scrubbed it away with the heel of her palm, exhaling unsteadily. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "You won't," he promised, though neither of them could pretend it was more than hope. When the nurse came to escort him to pre-op, Lena rose and pressed her hand to his chest, right over the place where his heart stuttered under the thin cotton of the gown. "Come back," she said, her voice rough. "I will. And if you don't—" He caught her wrist before she could finish. "I will." She didn't argue. She just nodded and stepped aside to let the nurse wheel him away. The operating theater was small compared to the ones he'd known in New York. No press of observers behind glass, no phalanx of residents whispering notes. Just Lena, 2 surgeons, and a scrub nurse who looked too young to understand the weight of what they were attempting. As the anesthesiologist fitted the mask over his nose and mouth, Ethan searched for her eyes one last time. She was there, standing at the head of the table, her expression calm. Only her hands betrayed her, flexing and curling at her sides as if they didn't know how to be still. "I trust you," he managed, though the words were slurred. Her lips parted. "I trust you too." The world went gray. He surfaced hours later in fits and starts, snatches of sensation that made no sense. The low beep of monitors, the antiseptic sting of IV lines, the rustle of fabric. Once, he thought he felt her hand in his hair, but he couldn't be sure if it was memory or wish. When he finally woke fully, the light in the room had gone soft and blue, the color of early evening. He turned his head with an effort. Lena was asleep in the chair by the bed, her legs tucked under her, her cheek pillowed on her forearm. "Hey," he rasped. Her eyes flew open. For a moment, she only stared at him, as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Then she let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. "You're here," she breathed. "I told you," he managed. "I always come back." She pressed her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. When she finally lowered her palm, her eyes were shining. "It worked," she whispered. "Your rhythm? It's strong. It's—" He reached for her. She rose at once, wrapping both hands around his. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For not giving up." Her smile was unsteady. "I couldn't." They stayed like that for a long time, his thumb tracing circles against her knuckles. Every few minutes she would check the monitor again, as if she needed the proof. He didn't mind. If this was what it took for her to believe he was really alive, he'd let her check 1,000 times. Later, when the rest of the team had left, she helped him sit up. The motion left him breathless, but it also brought an unexpected clarity. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was balancing on the edge of an inevitable decline. He felt possible. "What now?" she asked softly. He thought about it. About the boardrooms he no longer feared, the lawsuits that no longer defined him, the empire that would never matter as much as this moment. "Now," he said, "we go home." Her brows lifted. "Home?" "Wherever you are," he said simply. Her eyes went soft. "That's not very strategic. It's the only strategy that matters." She didn't reply in words. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise. When she pulled back, he caught her hand and pressed it to his heart. "No more running," he said. "No more running," she echoed. In the weeks that followed, they returned to New York together. The clinic was still there, Zach waiting. The board still bristled with suspicion, but the investors who'd once whispered about removing Ethan now scrambled to praise his conviction. Lena's name appeared in headlines across the globe, sometimes lauded as the visionary who had saved a billionaire's life, sometimes criticized as the reckless doctor who broke every rule. But none of that mattered, because every morning, Ethan woke with her beside him, her hand resting over the scar that no longer defined him. And every night, they walked the halls of the lab she'd reclaimed, their voices low as they planned the next phase of the work she had nearly lost. Some debts, he had learned, could never be repaid. They could only be honored. With truth, with loyalty, with love that didn't ask for permission. And in that small corner of the city, far above the noise of Wall Street, Ethan Caldwell and Lena Cho finally built something neither of them had ever dared believe in. A life not borrowed or stolen, but wholly, defiantly their own. In the end, this story isn't just about wealth, reputation, or even survival. It's about how the most important things in life, truth, dignity, love, can never be bought or silenced. Ethan Caldwell spent years believing that success meant power over everyone and everything, but standing at death's door taught him the greatest power comes from vulnerability, from admitting you need someone, from choosing to stand beside them when it would be easier and safer to look away. Lena Cho lost everything because she dared to tell the truth. She spent years invisible, cleaning hallways no one else cared to see, but she never lost her purpose. She never let bitterness erase her compassion, and when the moment came to step back into the light, she did so not for fame or revenge, but because she refused to watch another life be stolen by greed and fear. Their story reminds us that redemption is never instant or easy. It demands courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to fight for what is right, even when the world tells you to sit down and be quiet. It shows us that no matter how deep the betrayal or how high the walls built to keep you out, the truth has a way of finding its voice, and sometimes that voice is your own. So if you're standing at your own crossroads, remember this: you are more than your mistakes, more than what others have taken from you. You are still worthy of being seen. Thank you for spending time with this story. I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, love, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.